Death is a pervasive, inescapable phenomenon, and it has always fascinated me. When I was younger, I read the obituaries every Sunday morning, making comparisons between those of the young and old, and how people's deaths were represented. However, during the coronavirus pandemic, sickness and death was no longer relegated to the obituary section, but rampant throughout entire newspapers, as writers sought to convey the immense impact and staggering death toll of COVID throughout the world. When the pandemic first broke out, I was checking the COVID dashboard and Googling statistics nearly every day, horrified by the rising numbers of both cases and deaths. Many coronavirus patients face the horrific reality of dying alone or being comforted by only nurses and doctors in their final hours. As a child, I would have panic attacks every night about dying, so it's easy to imagine how scary it would be to die with no familiar face present. When I read newspaper articles about this subject, I was moved to tears. Flash forward 2 years later, and I find that I've become desensitized to stories about the pandemic in the media. I no longer cry when I read news stories that I would have found deeply disturbing back in the spring of 2020, or I just can't even be bothered to read the news stories in the first place. As a society, we don't even want to hear anything about the pandemic anymore, and for many of us, it feels like it's over, even though there are still hundreds of people that die every day and every week. COVID is still being written about in the news, but the emotional impact that the stories have on readers and the way that it is being talked about has changed.
To track how the perception of death surrounding the COVID-19 pandemic changed over time, we looked at how the media portrayed COVID death rates during the first, second, and fourth waves of the pandemic in the United States. We focused on specific news outlets that allowed us to filter articles by topic and specific date range. For the first wave of COVID, I searched for articles about COVID deaths from March to May of 2020. The main topic of most of these articles can be summarized into three categories. The first being death toll numbers. As coronavirus death toll tops 50,000. Coronavirus deaths top 300K. Coronavirus deaths top 4,000 in US, surpass China. The second being mistrust in the validity of the death toll count. Official counts understate the U.S. coronavirus death toll. New York City coronavirus deaths may be underreported by more than 5,000. The pandemic's hidden toll, 500,000 deaths. The third being warnings for a long pandemic to come. Brace yourself for waves of coronavirus infections. U.S. to prepare for a very painful 2 weeks. For the second wave of the pandemic, I focused on articles from December of 2020 through February of 2021. The first category I noticed was death toll updates. Fewer of these articles had numbers in the headings, and most number headings had explanations for why the numbers were so big. The second topic was stories about individuals. These usually highlighted young individuals who had died of COVID. California reports the most coronavirus deaths in a single day. U.S. coronavirus death toll surpasses 350,000 as experts anticipate post-holiday surge. Helen Etuk, who planned to be a pediatrician, dies at 20. Tone Hodge, opera singer with a powerful work ethic, dies at 38. For the third wave, I focused on articles written from January of 2022 through March of 2022. While some of these articles focused on current death toll counts, most focused on reflecting how COVID deaths had affected us as a society. The reflectionary nature of these articles almost made it feel like COVID was a thing of the past. U.S. COVID-19 death toll breaches 900K mark. 1 million deaths, the whole the pandemic made in U.S. society. An economic evaluation of COVID lockdowns. Ash Wednesday forces us to confront death, but it also offers hope. Counting COVID-19 cases doesn't capture the pandemic's impact.
Although it feels like society and our communities have become a lot more numb to the reporting of more COVID deaths each day as we enter 2021, 2022, and are about to enter 2023 in a few months, we've become less sensitive and emotionally thrown as these deaths have simply converted into numbers and statistics. As mentioned in an NPR podcast on how COVID deaths are now dismissed or stigmatized, many families tell their stories from a stance of anger and shame. When Kyle Dixon passed away due to COVID in mid-2021 at the very young age of 27, his sister's grief quickly converted into anger as she was reminded by how much misinformation had propagated in the past year, and how this misinformation had in fact impacted her brother himself, which fostered a dismissive attitude towards the pandemic, making his death all the more painful. The deaths of individuals years into the pandemic has changed in media portrayal, as the statistics almost become less significant to viewers due to the fact that many of us have been desensitized to hearing about these tragedies. In reality, however, these deaths are not any less tragic for loved ones, and if anything, have become more painful and isolating, as they must reconcile the loss of family members and friends so late into the pandemic, because so many people's ideas or thoughts regarding COVID-19 have not changed, or they are simply not attentive to the news due to a lack of concern for others during such a hard time period for the world.